Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of the webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. In this session, I'll be giving a presentation about exploring the outcomes of social capital. And this is something that I've been thinking about and working on for the last several years. It's something that is part of a body of work that I've been doing for the last maybe 20 or more years, which is trying to synthesize the existing literature and to help researchers to understand the different conceptual approaches to social capital, hopefully a little bit better, and therefore be able to conduct research on social capital that is more effective or that has more explanatory value. So the outline or overview for this session. The key goal here is really to encourage people to consider what are or are not outcomes of social capital, and to explore and identify what social capital is and how it works. And I really hope these ideas will promote further exploration of the underlying processes and stronger theory development in social capital research. So the first thing I'll do is consider why exploring the outcomes of social capital is actually useful. I'll then delve into some of the underlying propositions of what social capital is, so touching on what the capital nature of social capital. And I think it's really important to do this because if we want to understand what social capital does, then we need to understand some of these core propositions of what we're talking about when we're talking about social capital. I'll discuss the goal-oriented nature of social capital being a form of capital, and also some ways in which we might try to evaluate what is high or low social capital or positive or negative social capital, because these terms are so often thrown around, and I think it'd be good to explore what these ideas might actually mean. Then I'll get into the outcomes of social capital, because maybe all types of action are outcomes of social capital, or only maybe certain types of action. So I'll present a typology to help us to explore perhaps which actions are or which actions aren't, or at least get us thinking about these ideas. So why would we consider outcomes of social capital? And I think it's because social capital is elusive. It's difficult to define, and yet it's charged with a lot of very important outcomes, as we'll see when we get into some of the literature. But there's this black box, involving what social capital actually is and what it does. And I constantly have questions when I read literature of why, and a lot of these questions remain largely unanswered in the literature. And so what I hope is, by considering the outcomes, it may help us to identify what social capital is and separate it from what it does. And I think also importantly, it may help us to intervene in improving outcomes, so improving the effectiveness of social capital when we apply it in various contexts. So if we explore what the literature has to say about outcomes, and if you do a search for social capital outcomes, as I have done, you'll probably find relatively little or few results. But if you dig into the literature and you try and piece it together, you'll find that the key outcome is cooperation and collective action. And this is often specifically described in many definitions. But of course, we understand that it can help people to get by or to get ahead. It can facilitate information flows where people can share useful information with each other. It can reduce transaction costs. It can enable social introductions. It can be a facilitator of reciprocity and giving and exchange, perhaps even innovation and conflict resolution, and there's many more. And I've compiled a relatively short list. Well, it's a long list, but the real list from the literature, of course, would be much longer. And when I read this list, it doesn't actually help me to understand what social capital actually does and how it works. So I think before we go much further, we need to identify some of these core propositions related to the concept to help us to dig into and develop a deeper understanding of what social capital is, hopefully then to illuminate what these outcomes are. So I think it's really important to explore what capital is, because social capital is a form of capital, and it's something that's been discussed by various authors over the years. Nan Lin, for example, explored in detail what capital is in the context of social capital, but also other authors such as Carl Bankston, Lyndon Robertson, of course, and there's many others who have explored this in some detail. But I think we can agree that social capital, the nature of capital, is surplus value. It can be a byproduct of other activities, but it's this remaining or residual value that can be accumulated. We can invest in it with an expectation of return in future, and it permits increased production or outcomes in the future, and it can be maintained, depreciated, and enhanced. So if we apply these ideas of what capital is to social capital, then we could say that it is something we invest in with expectations that it'll do something in future. And I've highlighted something because I'm being deliberately vague about what that is, because there are many different perspectives about what it is that does this. But it has this quality of being able to invest in with expectations it will do something in future. So what we're saying is that the social capital is something that can or does do something in future. That's a really important quality. So it does not describe a state of being that is separate from a goal. Social capital is goal-oriented. It can do something. It's not just simply a state of being. For example, trust describes a state of being where people are generally trustworthy or believe other people to be trustworthy, whereas social capital describes something that has a potential to do something. And I think that's a really important distinction that we need to make when we understand what this something is. And I'm continuing to be vague about what that is until we get a bit further along. So if we put this into a schema of the source, the form, and the outcomes of social capital, then it's an investment or byproduct. That creates a potential that can provide future benefits and returns. But of course, there are many different ideas about what that potential actually is. So some scholars tend to focus on social structure and organization as creating that potential or being that potential for future returns. Others may focus on networks or network configuration, others on trust and norms or institutions, or empathy as being the source of that potential, the ability to do something in future. I think most scholars acknowledge that social capital has several components. That is, that it's multidimensional. And many authors give a list of these components, but on closer examination, these lists are really examples rather than exhaustive lists. And the underlying processes seem to remain obscured. And for many people, this creates confusion about what social capital actually is and is not. So the questions remain: if social capital is networks, then how and why is this a potential for action and therefore capital? And this will be explored further. But I think this schema is consistent with all forms of capital, because it is that stock that has the potential to create a flow. So if we look at something like human capital as an example, then we understand human capital to be the knowledge, skills, abilities, experience, intelligence, competencies that individuals possess. So as an example, a surgeon has extensive human capital that allows them to perform complex surgeries. They've gone to medical school, they've been in training, they have a huge amount of human capital that enables them to do what they do. But the human capital is not the surgery, the action part. It is those skills and abilities that make it possible for the surgeon to perform that surgery. When the surgeon is lying on the beach on holiday, they still possess the human capital, even if they're not activating it at that particular time, even if they're not engaging in those actions. They still have that potential to perform that surgery. So applying this idea to social capital is not the act of cooperating. It is that potential ability, capacity to cooperate. And I think that's a really important distinction. If we put human capital of a surgeon into our schema of capital, then the source is the extensive education and training and so forth that the surgeon has done. The actual human capital, the form, is the knowledge and skills and abilities. And the outcome then is successful surgeries. So it is a stock that has a potential to create a flow, and that flow is the successful surgeries. And I hope this schema will help us to understand social capital a little bit better about what social capital actually is. But of course, capital is goal-oriented. It's not a single entity, and it does not produce a single outcome. So examples of this may be that physical capital could be a factory that produces goods, or a truck that transports goods. These are different entities that are all described under the umbrella of physical capital, and they do different things. And the same would be true of human capital. The surgeon has detailed skills and abilities to be able to perform a surgery, but this same capital does not allow the surgeon to pilot a plane, to construct a bridge, to design fashion. So I think applying this to social capital, we need to understand that the nature of social capital that facilitates innovation, one particular outcome of social capital, is likely different to the social capital that improves, for example, employment opportunities. And really, if we divorce social capital from its goals and just treat it as a single entity that is always the same, then surely this decreases the explanatory power that social capital has. And I think this is a really important point for us to think about further and see how we can understand the variety of social capitals, if you like. Just like there are many different forms of physical capital, many different forms of human capital allow many different outcomes. Perhaps the same is also true of, and it is true, I think, of social capital. So if we explore what that something is that social capital does, what does the literature say that it does? And I think most of the authors will make reference to actions. Bob Putnam talked about it facilitating coordinated actions. Jim Coleman talked about certain actions of actors. Nan Lin talked about accessing or mobilizing in purposive actions. So the outcomes of social capital are actions. That's kind of what I've been getting at through the start of this presentation. And I put in brackets here also, and the intrinsic values related to this potential for action. And I'll return to this a little bit later. But the important point here is that social capital is not the action. I think that's pretty clear. It's something that produces that action in future. It is that future benefit or future production or future outcome that social capital can produce. So it is something that facilitates, but it's not, and that is the potential. Social capital is the potential for action. But I want to make an important point here, and that is that the potential for action is not a suitable definition of social capital. Potential describes the something, but the something is still not defined. And I'll make that point again a little later. I think it's an important one. So we look a little wider in the literature rather than three of those very commonly cited and popular authors. We tend to see the potential nature of social capital evident in all of these definitions in the literature. So reference to interactions, which is a type of action, cooperation, behavior, dealings, interactions, all of these things describe that potential nature of what social capital is. So if we unpack this a little bit more, based on capital theory, we're saying that an investment or a byproduct of other activities creates a potential that can provide future benefits or returns. And so there's some key questions then that I think we need to explore and answer. What creates the potential? What is the potential? And I think we've probably already have an answer to what are the outcomes. Now, those answers, those outcomes being social action, and the intrinsic outcomes associated with them. But then we still have a big question. What is that actual potential? And of course, because the outcomes are action, or at least social action, then this really relates to why do humans act cooperatively? And I'll explore this a little bit more, and I'll explore the meaning of social action a little later in the presentation as well. But why do humans act cooperatively? And we certainly have a lot of theories of human action. In a very interesting publication done in 2022, Easter and co-authors wrote this paper called Why People Do What They Do, an interdisciplinary synthesis of human action theories. And they found 86 different theories of human action. And you may not be able to read the detail in this diagram. It's actually just to illustrate that there are a large number of them. And what the authors did was they connected the green labels towards the right-hand side with the disciplines, the blue labels on the left-hand side, with the relative thickness of each connector representing approximately how much attention each theory received in those publications. And I did further analysis on these 86 theories of human action by categorizing them into meta-theories. So again, it doesn't really matter that it's too hard to read this diagram. It just shows how much variety and how many different theories of human action there are in scholarly inquiry. Now, those meta-theories that appear on the left-hand side are explored in a little bit more detail in this table. So this is a simplified diagram showing the structure of each of these meta-theories. So on the left-hand side, we can see broad categorization of independent theories of self and structure, and then 4 needs-based theories of cognitive, psychological, communal, and economic. And then there's an interdependent theory and a top-down theory as well. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to go into too much more detail about this. I just wanted to flag that there are a lot of theories of human action in the literature, but unfortunately that fewer are discussed in relation to social capital theory, even though that question of why do humans act or act cooperatively is really the core question of what social capital is, what should be driving our understanding of what social capital is, and therefore what it does. So I'll return to this a little later, but I want to explore when social capital is less than ideal, when there are potentially negative outcomes of social capital. And so think of a situation where there is widespread or pervasive distrust, that is where people are not inclined to be trusting or trustworthy. So there's potential for many negative or less than optimal outcomes in that situation. There may be additional costs or frictions or tensions or loss of efficiency or productivity. People may be less likely to cooperate or collaborate, less likely to act positively towards each other, perhaps more likely to act alone rather than risk working with others. And there may be various costs associated with additional rules and enforcement of the rules, and costs associated with betrayals of trust and so forth. I think, therefore, really an environment of distrust represents a lack of potential for positive social action and a greater potential for negative social action. So we can certainly understand that social capital isn't always ideal, and there's the potential even for negative outcomes. So the question then is, would we describe this as low social capital or negative social capital or weak social capital? There's all these different ways of describing it. So before we get into what we might call this and how we might understand it, let's have a think about what positive and negative social capital may be. And I think it's true that social capital tends to always have some degree of positive and negative outcomes. We can't simply say that social capital is positive in one situation and negative in a different situation. It has some degree of positive and negative outcomes for different people or in different ways from different perspectives, really in every situation. And some examples here that are quite tangible is trustworthiness can reduce transaction costs, but it could also introduce opportunities for exploitation. Norms can facilitate beneficial actions, but can constrain innovation and creativity. And even something as simple as benefits for the in-group can create exclusion of out-group members. And of course, an important point is that evaluation of positive and negative outcomes requires a perspective or an orientation towards a goal. And Carl Bankston's new book, he discusses this in a bit of detail, and he comes to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense for there to be negative social capital. That term doesn't make sense because how can a stock, a form of capital, be described as negative? But when we understand that it's the outcomes that may be a positive or negative rather than the capital itself, perhaps it makes a bit more sense. We could also describe high and low social capital. So if we understand social capital to be that potential for social action, as we were describing within the schema of capital, then low social capital is a low potential for action. So this low potential is a low ability or capacity for social action of any kind, positive or negative. So for example, if you came across somebody and they didn't speak your language, they're not from your culture, they're not familiar with your economic or legal system, then there's a low ability for social action. If you don't know your neighbors, then there's limited potential for action, regardless of what sort of social trust there may be. If people are disconnected, then you really lack the mechanisms for interaction and exchange. And so we could describe these situations as low social capital, that low potential for social action. So examples there: disconnected, lack of understandings, self-interest, uncertainty. But of course, that's if we understand social capital as the potential for social action. But if we define social capital positively, then it might be a different situation. Low social capital could describe a low potential for positive outcomes. And one cause may be negative outcomes that disrupt or discourage cooperation and collective action. So we'll return for a moment to that idea that outcomes of capital could be negative, because this seems to be a challenging idea. And certainly I think that it requires a small deviation from classical theories of capital. The classical theory of capital defined where it permits future production. And clearly negative outcomes couldn't be defined as a increased future production. So if we are to understand negative outcomes, then it does require that deviation. But of course, capital is separate from how it is used. And examples of this is that human capital can be used to make a bomb. And the often cited example is John Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, who was a mathematics professor and by all accounts used extensive human capital in making this bomb, and the outcomes clearly were negative. Financial capital can be used to fund terrorism, and even as simple as a hammer can be used to build a house or as a weapon. So we can see that capital is separate from how it is used, and same thing with social capital. How social capital is used does not make it positive or negative, because it's still a potential for action that underpins that. And of course, what constitutes positive and negative outcomes is a matter of perspective. For example, for the mafia, social capital was incredibly positive and produced positive outcomes for the members, but perhaps for the victims of organized crime and for society more broadly, the outcomes were very negative, and therefore a perspective is required often in evaluating the outcomes. And I think most importantly, if we define social capital as only producing positive outcomes, then it creates a paradox where the same phenomena may or may not be social capital based on the eventual outcomes that they may produce. And this clearly is an unworkable situation. And therefore, I think we do need to make that small deviation from classical theories of capital to understand that social capital may produce negative outcomes. So putting these ideas together as what is high and low and what is possibly positive and negative outcomes of social capital, we could understand towards the left side of this diagram a low potential for action, and therefore I've drawn this line, a low potential for positive outcomes or negative outcomes, because there's purely a low potential for action. But where there is higher social capital, there is higher potential for action of any kind, keeping in mind, of course, there's always really going to be a mix of positive and negative outcomes depending on the perspective involved. So I mentioned earlier about the definition of social capital. I think it's important to clarify that really for academic inquiry, social capital cannot be defined as the potential for social action, because both the potential and social action are just far too vague. There's more questions that would need to be answered for scholarly inquiry. And I think in terms of answers to those questions, some scholars tend to focus on one reason, while others try to incorporate multiple reasons. And clearly reasons are important, and that's something that I'll explore in a little more detail as well. So I think for most approaches, it's just not systematic. They're not clear about what social capital is, how it works, and they end up just including, it feels quite random or ad hoc. different ideas about what creates that potential without an underlying theory of what social capital is. I'm just going to skip over the next couple of slides in the interest of time. I'll make available the slide deck after the presentation if you want to explore those slides in more detail. So I've developed this little schema or typology of modes of action that may relate to social capital to help us to explore which ones are, or perhaps which ones aren't, outcomes of social capital. So one mode is acting with others, where we engage in collective action, coordinated action, or cooperation in the pursuit of shared goals. And I think examples of this are interest groups, sporting groups, cooperatives, virtually all organizations are examples where we work together in the pursuit of shared goals. And I think everybody would agree that this is an outcome of social capital. This way of acting is an outcome of social capital. Then there's another type of or mode of action where it's action directly towards others. So it's involving or impacting, relating to, or accommodating others directly, including cooperation in the pursuit of others' goals. So examples here may be helping and sharing, giving social introductions and so forth, as well as perhaps not so positive outcomes such as exclusion, discrimination, exploitation. In this category, it's actions directly towards others. We may also consider actions relating to or affecting others indirectly. So this may include actions related to property or common property, or involving various externalities. So examples may be removing a dangerous object from the road, recycling actions that obviously relate to others but don't relate to others directly. Many forms of crime also, graffiti, for example, relate to common property resources quite often, or other people's property, but isn't directly related to another individual. Littering, overexploitation of resources and so forth may be in this category. We also have actions influenced by others. So these are actions shaped by the expectations, obligations, or actions of others, but are not affecting or related to others. So these are actions such as, personal health actions, exercise, patterns of media consumption, educational choices. There's obviously a very wide range of actions here, but they don't relate to other people. These are actions we take upon ourselves. So I think we can see when we think about that list, we may very quickly form an opinion about which modes of action we think are outcomes of social capital, and perhaps ones that aren't. And part of the motivation for creating this typology was that when reading the literature, I often find reference to outcomes such as personal health, which seems to not relate to other people, as described as an outcome. And I wanted to explore what that might be and whether or not that really is and should be considered to be an outcome of social capital. But I want to acknowledge as well that there are various causal paths that may be involved here. That, the potential for action that we're describing as social capital may produce the desired outcomes directly. Maybe it's reciprocity or giving type actions. Sometimes that potential for action will create intrinsic outcomes that then produce the desired outcomes. So, for example, social capital may just simply knowing that there is that potential for action, for social support and belonging, it may make someone feel happy. And that happiness may then produce the desired health behaviors, the desired outcome that we're looking for. And of course, there may be a causal pathway where the potential creates action outcomes, and with other inputs, it creates the desired outcomes we're interested in. So, for example, with innovation, it's facilitated by certain types of actions and not others. But simply measuring the potential for action will provide little indication of the potential for innovation, partly because innovation is the result of multiple inputs, not just social action. So I think it's important to consider that when we're thinking about which of these modes of action relate to social capital. And certainly, I think we can all agree that actions with others is definitely included. Maybe it is actions with others and actions towards others directly that are included here. But then again, maybe it's three of them, or maybe in fact it's all four of them. So we need some ways of actually understanding what that might be. But before we'll get into that, I want to explore a little bit the modes of acting with others, because this is a special case. When we act with others, there may be all different ways in which we do that. So we may be looking to achieve together, where we're working together to help members to achieve something, such as a company or a cooperative. We may be overcoming something together, such as working together to overcome adversity, such as an environmental condition or a natural disaster. We may be supporting others together, such as a charity. We may be against others together, such as working against other people. And so these, we may say that the first two, achieving together and overcoming together, are quite inward looking, whereas supporting others together or against others together are quite outward looking. The first three, probably based on empathy and a desire to do good in the world, whereas against others together is really based on antipathy and perhaps motivated by a desire to do harm, defensive and destructive acts against others. So these are sort of a special case of different ways in which we might act together, and understanding these may help us to explore the outcomes of social capital in more detail. So how can we separate what actions are or not outcomes of social capital? And one way we might do that is to consider the orientation of the action. Is it social or is it non-social? We may describe and explore the reason and rationality, whether it's based on self-interest or some other form of action. Or perhaps we explore the nature of consensus. Is it voluntary? Is it involuntary action? Does that help us to uncover which are outcomes of social capital and which are not? And I think the point here, the reason to do this is because if all actions are outcomes of social capital, that makes the concept incredibly broad. It basically relates to absolutely everything that humans do. And that's rarely a good situation that has explanatory beneficial power. So in terms of the first one, orientation of action, I think the logical place to look is to Weber. So social action is defined by Weber as action is social insofar as, by virtue of the subjective meaning attached to it by the acting individual or individuals, it takes account of the behavior of others and therefore is oriented in its course. And he uses a classic example of opening an umbrella when it starts raining. This is not a social action if it's simply in response, a group of people opening an umbrella in response to it starting raining. But there are situations where opening an umbrella clearly is social, where it is oriented towards others, where it's part of a demonstration to open an umbrella or a performance. There's lots of situations. So we can't judge an individual action as being social or not purely on the action. We need to look at its orientation, or perhaps we need to look at beyond that as to the reason, the why that the people were doing that particular action. So under this way of thinking about it, it's the orientation that represents the potential for action that is social capital. So if we think about this, then perhaps only the first two really are outcomes of social capital, because these are the actions that are oriented towards others, directly at least, whereas the others perhaps influence others indirectly, or they're influenced by others' actions, but I'm not sure if that means that the actions are oriented towards others. So that way of thinking about it may provide a way to separate which action outcomes are social capital and are not. Another way of thinking about it is exploring the reason or rationality. Because as I was saying, opening an umbrella could be just simply in response to rain. It could be this cognitive instrumental form of reason, satisfying individual ends or in the analysis of facts and objects. It could be that. But it could also be part of a presentation, a performance. It could be coordinated in some way. And so it may be based on some other form of reason or rationality. There's multiple different ways of considering reason and rationality, and in most cases there's at least two main forms of reason. The first being means-end rationality, which is like cognitive instrumental in this schema, and the other one being value rational reason. And I'll explore a couple of these because I think this helps us to illuminate what is actually driving the types of actions that we see in social capital. So under this schema, which is really from Habermas, there's the cognitive instrumental. There's also the moral practical rationality in justifying rules for living together based on shared interpretations of what is right and appropriate. And there's also the aesthetic expressive rationality in exploring meaning and significance attributed by an individual based on their own subjective experience. And we engage in all of these forms of rationality, often all at the same time, in shaping the reason for our actions. So if we look at the aesthetic expressive reason, we may attribute special meaning and significance to a person or an object based on some subjective experience that we've had. You know, they were my father's golf buddy, and therefore this particular individual has special significance. Or, you know, this baseball was the winning home run in the World Series, and so it attributes special meaning and significance that goes far beyond simply means end or cognitive instrumental reason. And of course, also moral and practical in the justifying rules for living together, you know, the norms, what we believe is right and wrong. You know, this is another way that isn't necessarily means end form of rationality. So exploring these different ways of reasoning can help us to explore and uncover what the outcomes of social capital are, but also what social capital actually is. And I think what we tend to see is in social capital research, we see mostly reason towards the left side here. You know, we tend to see cognitive instrumental forms of reason being applied, particularly in a lot of the sort of network theory, network approach literature. We tend to see a lot of moral practical reason being applied in the more normative approaches to social capital. But I don't think these are often taken into account, and I don't think we tend to see a balanced approach to understanding the reasons for human action. So other ways of considering types of rationality are Max Weber's types. These are also quite similar. They break down perhaps that the left two are both means end forms of rationality, whereas the right two are more value rational forms of rationality. And these make a lot of sense, and these can be used to explain various different forms of human action. And we may also explore his typology of social action, the means end rational action towards achieving particular goals of the actor, the value rational types of social action oriented towards achieving ends derived and determined by values, as well as effectual action motivated by the emotions of individuals, and traditional action derived from the customs and traditions of society as well. So this could help in uncovering different types of action that are outcomes of social capital. And of course, there's also Lyndon Robinson's actions that meet the various needs. So internal and external validation, the need for commodities, the need for belonging, and the need for transcendence. And so if we try and put all of this together into one typology, if we look at what is less social capital and perhaps more social capital, again, being a little bit vague and broad about these terms, you know, talking about social capital as one broad thing. But the predominant type of action, I think, where there is less social capital is this type of instrumental action. You know, and if we look at the orientation of that type of action, then it's more oriented towards the self, whereas where there is more social capital, we tend to see perhaps social action, or perhaps we could describe that as more value rational action or cooperative action, or perhaps communicative action. Social action seems to be a broad term that we could use to describe that, where it's more oriented towards others. modes of rationality that might be involved in these situations, is where there is less social capital. Reason may be dominated by basically self-interest, by cognitive instrumental rationality in meeting various ends by certain means. Whereas where there is more social capital, we may tend to see integrated reason incorporating objective, normative, moral, subjective rationality, or whatever categories you would like to choose from Habermas or from Weber or so forth. I think there tends to be a higher level of consensus where there is more social capital, because really cooperation requires a high level of consensus and consent and agreement and shared understandings about the rules of the game, what is appropriate, what should be done. And in those situations, we have a higher level of consensus. And if we break down perhaps those modes of consensus a little bit more, in where there is more social capital, actors tend to agree on modes of cooperation that can be justified as intentionally good across 3 different criteria: intentionally good, socially appropriate or right, and factually true. And where there is less social capital, perhaps people understand that really actors are oriented towards individual success. And in between, of course, there's a whole variety of weaker forms of cooperative action in which not necessarily all 3 of those validity claims are at stake, and people still engage in some form of cooperative action, but perhaps not as cooperative and oriented towards others as it could be. So it's a lot of different ideas that I've put out there, and I think there's some key points. First of all is that as a form of capital, social capital is a potential to do something, and it's goal-oriented. We need to stay true to that oriented nature of social capital. Outcomes of social capital are actions. I think that's pretty clear. And of course, also the intrinsic outcomes associated with the potential for those actions. We see that in other forms of capital as well. Natural capital, for example, may be the natural assets, but there's also intrinsic values or non-use values of natural capital that need to be considered as well. Simply having a pristine rainforest in a particular area is of value to everybody psychologically, and even in being able to go for a walk in those natural areas without using them or extracting them in any way as well. So there's action outcomes as well as the intrinsic outcomes. Social capital, like other forms of capital, can be used for positive and negative ends. And we really can't judge the outcomes of social capital. We can't judge the capital by the outcomes, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We need to find ways of understanding and exploring what that means. But there still are a lot of questions remaining about what actions are actually outcomes of social capital. And I presented a typology of different, perhaps, modes of acting that we may consider, and perhaps some of the reasons or motivations that lie behind those actions that we may explore in understanding those actions, and hopefully therefore also understanding more fully what social capital actually is. So there's these fundamental questions about why humans act and these different modes of rationality that I think we need to explore in more detail to formulate a more rigorous theory and understanding of what social capital is and how it works. So references that are perhaps a little bit too small to read, but you can revisit them if you want to explore some of the sources for this presentation. And I'd like to now open it up for questions and discussion. I guess the first question is was there anything in the chat that I have missed?
No. I asked a question at the very beginning. It's more a hypothesis, because I thought about this non-transferability of human capital. And then I thought about, we clearly have this transformation curve in physical capital or financial capital that you cannot transform it one-to-one. But there's some degree of substitutability. And I thought about if there is the same thing for human capital, like, for example, if I'm a surgeon and I want to transform my capital or make use of this capital to become another highly specialized person, like, for example, a chief, very good chef who has a very good cuisine. Then of course, most of my competences would not help me, but I think that's not a no-go, because that's the same thing with physical capital, but I could use some competencies. And then I thought about if there is some basic human capital that is most of the time used for all things, that keeps the whole thing together. And I thought about if there might be something the same in social capital, but I'm not sure about it. It was just a thought for discussion.
I think that's an interesting idea, and I completely agree that there are. You could imagine within, say, physical capital, we could create computer chips. So it's a form of human capital. It is a human-made asset that can be used for future production. But those computer chips could go into a wide variety of different products, or and be transformed again into, I guess, many different forms of physical capital. And so perhaps the same is true for human capital. The example you've given there, that a surgeon needs to learn, basic mathematics, basic communication skills. There's a wide range of skills and abilities that are widely applicable to being a surgeon, but also to a wide variety of other action outcomes as well that person may engage in. And so I completely agree with that. And I think applying the same idea to social capital, we would see much the same thing, where there is, basic norms of living together, perhaps basic moral standards, basic trust. These kinds of ideas perhaps are widely applicable, regardless of the action outcomes that we're interested in. If we're looking to produce, for example, social innovation in a particular area, then those aspects of social capital that produce innovation may also produce social introductions that help people to get access to goods and services at cheaper prices. Like there are probably and almost certainly a huge amount of overlap, in the same way that all of the foundational understanding has a huge amount of overlap in human capital. So I think Jacob, that's a really useful contribution and a really useful way of thinking about how social capital is multiple different entities, but there's clearly a lot of overlap. It's not unique to producing one specific type of action. Clearly a certain nature or configuration of what we mean by social capital can produce a wide range of different outcomes. So any other questions? Anything you want me to explore in a little more detail? Any comments?
Tristan.
Raymond.
Yeah, I was wondering, I'd like to explore more how to build social capital. For example, you're starting a project for a certain area that's poor, and you need technology and innovation. You need to spur this creativity in people in the population so that they can produce innovations. And what literature can you point me to, or concepts that talk about how to build social capital, so that, for example, if I want, innovation ecosystem, so that this is a good input to economic growth of a country. How do you do that? I mean, that's a very broad concept. It's very difficult to get that cooperation from so many, especially if the country is widely diverse in terms of culture, these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really relevant question, because when we think about social capital as a single entity, then we're quite limited in the ways we might be able to intervene in building social capital. not to pick on any one conceptual approach to social capital, but if we understood it as purely networks, then our only option is simply to create more networks. We don't have other ways in which we can intervene. And so if we can understand more the complexity of social capital and what these various outcomes are, and particularly the goal-oriented nature of social capital, then it gives us a lot more options for being able to intervene in changing the situation to produce better outcomes. And so what I would do, and what I always do in my work, is I effectively reverse engineer the outcome that we're looking for. So if our desired outcome is innovation, then we consider what social actions are likely to produce better innovation. What do we want people to actually do? Do we want them to share information with each other? Do we want them to make social introductions and recommend other people? Do we want them to be very well connected so they know what other people's areas of specialty and expertise are, and they can make those social introductions? There's probably a wide range of different things. Do we want them to feel safe and secure, to be able to challenge the status quo, to do things differently, to make investments, this is often quite normative as to whether it's socially appropriate to do those kinds of things. And therefore, if we want them to, then we need to think about how we might get them to do that. And so by starting with the outcome we're interested in, we can then work backwards. What are the actions that we want individuals to take? And then going back, so they're the outcomes of social capital. So how can we therefore create the potential for people to act in that way? What are the barriers that may exist that are stopping people from acting in that way, from taking risks in trying new things, for example? What are the barriers that are standing in the way of that? What sort of incentives can we create that can help to enable that potential to occur more frequently within our target population? And then we can invest in those things. We can either directly or as a byproduct of other activities. Going back to that original schema that social capital is the potential, but it's created by investment or as a byproduct of other activities. So how can we construct these activities to help to facilitate the creation of that potential that creates the types or the certain types or modes of acting that then produce the outcome that we're interested in? So in your case, innovation.
Very good, very good. Thank you.
So there was a comment in the chat, an author who covers how to build social capital. And the points boil down to growth by transactions, discount by injustice. Thomas, did you want to explain what that means a little bit?
I would like just to refer to Piotr Sztąpka. He's quite an elder professor of sociology and former president of the International Society of Sociologists. So just redirect there. His work on the topic he far exceeds the formula of today's meeting, but he's a good reference on this point, I believe.
Right.
May I, using the time at the microphone, pose my question?
Yes.
Have you encountered a sensible reference to the valuation of the capital? If we want to invest, we'll surely want to see a return, and therefore also we need to be able to calculate that. In the scientific literature, have you encountered any attempts to do this?
Not particularly, I would say. I think where there's a body of literature, I believe, that attempts to value these social processes that we're talking about. Within social capital, it is very rare to see anyone attempt to create anything like a monetary value that could be used to assess a return on investment of, in these kinds of social potentials. So not so much in social capital, but perhaps some of the other literature on social return on investment, or perhaps social value, may be areas where there's been some attempts to create monetary valuations or more detailed quantitative valuations that could be used to assess return on investment. But I think it's inherently difficult to do because these potentials are so inherent in everything that we do. Our organizations represent an enormous potential to be able to work together, to act socially, to cooperate on shared goals. How we go about valuing that, I wouldn't know where to start. When the organization couldn't even exist without that potential, then the organization represents the potential. So how do you value it? I don't know.
Okay, unconsumed potential. There is a path through productivity, but anyway, it's certainly a collection of Lego boxes from various sources, not as a one chain of thought. So I've got an apparatus which is based on some works, but I'm still looking for a more reliable or through work on the topic.
Yeah.
If you encounter, give me a shout, please.
And perhaps by clarifying more about what social capital does, what the action outcomes are, would help then to value it, because we could be much clearer about the value of those outcomes. Like if we tried to value the human capital of a surgeon, it might be relatively straightforward because it's directly linked to their employment. And therefore, future salaries and earnings could be the value of their human capital. But because social capital is shared amongst multiple people, it is far more difficult to make those calculations, partially because the social capital is always really only one element in production. It facilitates information flows, social introductions, cooperation, collective action. This is only one element of production of virtually any kind of product or service, and therefore not only is it shared amongst multiple people, it's also just one part of the equation. And how do you value one part relative to another? These are important questions, of course, because decision makers want to know. If I were to invest $1 million in building social capital, is that a smart business decision? Am I going to get a return on that investment? And that is quite a difficult question to answer. I gave a presentation about this, exploring the limits of social capital, that if a business owner was presented with an option of investing $1 million or $100 million in social capital, which is the smarter choice. $1 million produces something good. Does $100 million produce something better? And I think the conclusion there was not necessarily, just based on the limits of social capital. You can't simply build and build and build social capital in an unlimited way. There tend to be trade-offs and declining areas of productivity. How much trust is enough trust, and is more trust better than what you have already? These are questions that are perhaps difficult to answer, but it's clear that you can't just simply continue to invest in this thing indefinitely. There are limits that slow its return on investment over time.
Tristan.
Raymond.
Just 2 comments or maybe a question. I'm appreciating this analysis in terms of different levels. There's this social capital analysis at the individual level in terms of personalities, at the organizational level, at the societal level and at the global level. So it becomes more complex, of course, as we analyze upwards. So I don't know if there's any research doing that or any literature that analyzes social capital in terms of these levels of analysis. And second is there any literature that points to analyzing social capital in terms of a historical perspective, before, after? So on measuring social capital before an intervention and then after, or maybe a deliberate intervention or emergent intervention that led to an outcome, a historical perspective.
I think Bob Putnam worked extensively on the historical perspective with his work on Italy. His first work on social capital in 1993 was really making the comparison between northern and southern Italy and the historical events that shaped those differences between the different regions. So I think that's a good example of that kind of work. I think there's relatively little work that I'm aware of, at least, keeping in mind, of course, that the social capital literature is incredibly broad. There may be tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of publications on the topic, but I'm not aware of anything that looks in a rigorous way at social capital before an intervention and then after an intervention to build social capital. But I expect that there could well be something on that. Again, we're probably a little hamstrung by what we're defining social capital as being, as to seeing the validity of those results or how useful those results are in changing or influencing the nature of interventions. So I'm not sure I particularly have good answers for you, except that there's an enormous amount of literature out there to look at that probably provide examples of what you're looking for. Did you have two questions or just the one?
Yeah, what about levels of analysis? Because I'm appreciating this in terms of, when you're doing research, for example, is it acceptable to say that, okay, I'm limiting my analysis to just the individual or just the organizational level, and just the societal level, nation, and global, Well, that's the way I'm appreciating this.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few authors who talk about the different levels. Even Jim Coleman talked about the integration of the macro and the micro analysis in social capital. I think David Halpern talked about the different levels in quite a bit of detail as well. I've talked about it in quite a few of my webinars and my articles as well, because what we're really talking about at these different levels is focusing on different things that encourage the potential, different things that represent the potential. At the micro level, it may be those individual competencies, those individual relationships that create the potential, those relational properties. Whereas once you move up to the higher levels, the ability to influence those individual relationships decreases. And so therefore it's more of those, institutional type factors that produce that potential for social action, that shape the nature of the reason or motivation, if you like, for action. Jacob, did you have a question or comment?
Two thoughts. First thought about this measuring of the value. Just when you were discussing it, one thing I reminded was the study of Hernando de Soto about the value or the cost of bureaucracy and property rights of the poor. And he, for example, he brought a research team, for example, to the Philippines and let them go through all bureaucratic processes which were obligated to open a barber shop officially with an official permit. And then they found out it takes 8 months and $3,000. And so he could thereby define the unofficial license that the poor can get is worth the $3,000 plus the opportunity cost for the time. So I think if but this is a very, very, very effort-intensive study design. This could be a way to go to measure at least the benefits of one intervention by finding out what are the alternative costs or what are the alternative things if I want to do things without a certain level of trust or certain attitudes I define as social capital. But as I said, it's a lot of effort. Another thought about what you said about positive and negative social capital. First, every time I listen to you, I find it purely fascinating. And second thing is, I think it's possible to define a physical or financial capital as positive or negative because we have a unidimensional system there. If there is a dollar or money is defined as positive and negative, and so I can even have negative social, I can have negative financial capital, which brings negative interest. I have to pay interest to the bank. I think we could also, if we would define objective outcomes, we could also have negative human human capital, for example, high psychological problems or so, which brings you deeper and deeper into problems. And if we would define, but this would be even more complicated, objective goals or at least goals that we would like to be objective or generally shared for a society to reach or for a group to reach, then we could also define properly negative social capital, because some attitudes or some specifications of group settings can make it, as you said, much more likely that certain outcomes, which we would then deem negative, come out then positive. And then it would be like a debt on the group potential to reach positive outcomes. But we would first have to agree what positive outcomes are. But these are just some random thoughts, and I don't know how useful they are.
No, I think they're useful thoughts. So maybe to look at the first one first about valuing, specifically an action if it occurred or if it didn't occur, the social action. I think the challenges are that how do we know if the action will occur and how frequently it will occur to then attribute those values to it. Take the example, my driveway was starting to break up and fracture, and fortunately, one of my friends was an engineer who worked in road construction and was able to guide me on how to stop my driveway from breaking up, and we could place a tangible value on that advice he was able to give me. Perhaps it was $5,000 because I didn't have to replace my driveway, or perhaps it was $1,000 because I didn't need to go and consult with a professional engineer and pay them for that advice. So we can place tangible values on that, but how do we know if that particular outcome will happen? How frequently will it happen? To be able to then attribute that value. And that's just an example of one area of value that came from that social relationship with that individual. And there may be many different hundreds or thousands of different examples of value where we could ascribe specific and tangible monetary values to it. But how do we know when it's going to happen and when it's going to come up?
To answer directly, but we are getting more and more into the direction of really a lot of effort. What I could do, of course, is to have regular interviews with you, at least weekly, probably bi-weekly, and ask you, with how many people have you had contact? How many advices or interventions of other people did you got that you found helpful? And record this, and after some time, or parallel, take stock of your income, and after some time take also stock of your capital, and then compare how much money you were able to save directly or by having a nice kept house. But this is, of course, really, really intensive, especially if I do it with more than one person, but 100 person or so, that I would need to reach some statistical power. And it would just be very reduced, because it would just, I could take some psychological values also and ask you about your well-being, but I would still have to reduce your life to some numbers.
Yeah, and I think that is a possible way to go about measuring social capital and valuing it. The key challenge, of course, is that we're still only measuring the outcomes, and those outcomes indicate that the potential exists. And over time, as long as the time and sample are sufficient, maybe it is giving us an indication of what outcomes normally occur from that potential, but it is still only measuring the potential and the outcome and not the potential. And I think it's very easy to think of specific examples where the potential remains as a stock, unrealized until it needs to be, or until it is. My best friend from school, who I haven't seen in 10 years or 20 years, is a stock effectively of social capital. It's unrealized until it is. And the same may be true of a surgeon who takes time away from work for years even. They still have that potential. It's just unrealized in that particular moment. So yes, I agree. And this is not an uncommon way to go about measuring social capital. Is to measure the outcomes, because they are the things that are most tangible, and they do give us information about the existence of the potential. We just need to continue to remain aware of what it is that we're measuring. What was the second part of your question? I've forgotten.
My second part of the question was about if we was a thought, if we define some objective outcomes, then the sort of negative social capital would make sense again, or negative human capital.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that is again a really challenging area, because the same thing can be put to very different kinds of uses. But clearly there are negative outcomes of social capital, of that potential for action, that were always going to be negative. However we define that: unproductive, uncooperative, unuseful, having other costs or expenses associated with them, having externalities, whatever it might be. I think this is where, because we tend to be quite vague about what social capital is and therefore what it does, it's difficult to identify what those things may be, that may produce those externalities, or may produce those other unwanted costs or outcomes that are considered undesirable from a particular perspective. But do we have any other questions or comments? If we just go back to my original goal here, was really just to explore some of these ideas, some of these questions that so often come up in my mind, and hopefully by doing so, it'll prompt a bit more reflection from other people in the field as well, and we might start to be able to resolve some of these challenges, answer some of these questions.
Tristan, this is Stephanie Davison. I can't figure out how to do, I'm on my phone, and so I'm not really figuring out how to do my video, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm wondering about how to harness the potential that you're talking about, how to harness the potential for action, basically, and how to measure that potential for action. Specifically, I'm wondering about it in terms of the United States and the two mostly opposing political I'm not sure what to call them. I don't want to call them parties, but political movements that have lots of social capital, if you will, like lots of trust and lots of momentum behind them, but then trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, if you will. And this speaks to not just what's going on here, but also like in politics across the world, which causes a lot of conflict. So it's sort of about conflict too, but it's like if we're talking about harnessing the potential for action, that's basically what you're saying is how we are looking at social capital, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So then how do we do that? And I know you kind of do this backwards design thinking, but doesn't seem to be that simple, especially when we have two or maybe even more than two movements that are so strong in their social capital is the best way for me to put it, like so strong in their trust, in their trust groups. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, if we go back to this one, then increasingly those political movements tend to be basically against others together, where they're not actually looking to achieve together, perhaps like they may have traditionally been doing so. They're looking to come together against the other political movement. And that increasingly is based on more on an antipathy and based on a lack of consensus and shared understanding between the parties, especially. So if we go back to this sort of overall typology of what more social capital looks like, then we tend to see a higher level of consensus between those people who are engaging in social action together, those direct forms of action that relate to each other. And so what we tend to see then with those two different political movements is a lack of consensus about what is intentionally good, what is socially appropriate and right, what is factually true. Like there isn't consensus across perhaps even any of those validity claims, and therefore it's very difficult for people to engage in social action with each other. And so therefore working backwards from that understanding of what we want to change, then we need to have people somehow agree on these validity claims.
Okay. Easier said than done. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, this is why everybody agrees that social relationships or social networks are so critically important to this, because social networks is what facilitates that communication, interaction, discussion that is the basis for reaching these forms of consensus. And so the problem, of course, is that we have people across the political movement who are socially divided in their relationships, and therefore they don't have these conversations, these forms of communication that seek to reach consensus, and therefore there can't be agreement on these validity claims, and therefore it's very difficult to have these forms of social action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tristan.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tristan.
Raymond.
Following up on Stephanie's question or comments, I was wondering if there's any comparison between on the highest level, capitalism versus socialism versus democratic socialism in the Scandinavian countries. Which political economic system creates better social capital, ergo better economic outcomes? Because we're seeing that the Scandinavian countries have consistently produced good numbers. I mean, in terms of equality, in terms of well-being, in terms of economic development, GDP, those numbers, no? Well, when I looked at the numbers, I'm seeing that the Scandinavian countries, the democratic socialist countries, are doing very good in these numbers, and they have a more egalitarian, ergo better social capital, as I'm putting it that way. So are there any studies that compare capitalism, socialism, China, Russia, and Scandinavian countries in terms of the potential, creating that potential for action that creates better economic outcomes, better human development index outcomes, health outcomes, these things, equality, etc.?
Interesting question. I think it's very, very broad and perhaps difficult to attribute causality to it. But I think instinctively what we're talking about is a tendency towards instrumental action in highly competitive capitalist economies, whereas perhaps a little bit more integrated reasoning in more socialist type, or at least social democratic, or however you want to describe it, where there's more social support systems and more emphasis placed on social support. You tend to get those other forms of reasoning and therefore different predominant forms of action occurring in those types of societies. This is a very, very broad categorization. And one thing I'd like to point out is that Nan Lin, in his work on social capital and social resources, really defined social capital as the mobilization of social resources through instrumental actions. And so he was finding effectively rational choice, means end type of rationality explanations for why social resources would be mobilized in social networks. And so it just because an economic system is capitalist and it's based on competition and self-interest, doesn't mean that there couldn't be a potential for many of the things that we're talking about, mobilization of social resources specifically, being commonplace and the foundation for that economic system. And so I think we're talking about many different processes at work here that may contribute towards the overall amount of social capital. I was very intentional in this diagram to label the left side, the instrumental action oriented towards self-interest. I labeled this as less social capital rather than no social capital or low social capital or something, because just intuitively, where people are acting in self-interest, they're not going to be as oriented towards others. They're surely not going to be acting on other people's interests. Therefore, they're not going to be as cooperative, as sharing, as giving, as so forth, as they would be if they were operating on, an orientation towards others and a more integrated form of reasoning. But I think that would be very interesting research to try to unpack that, very complex relationship between, broad economic systems and then the processes of reason that occur within society, which I think would be incredibly difficult to research as well, but it would be very interesting.
Yes, just a comment on the best of both worlds in terms of the democratic socialist system. They rejected the totalitarian autocratic leadership style and central planning that inhibits individual incentives and opportunities to act. So this system of state ownership of the means of production is limiting individual opportunities and incentives to act, unlike in the capitalist or democratic socialist countries that provides individual incentives because of private ownership. But in the democratic socialist countries, we have this state ownership of the key industries, but a lot of individual ownership of private capital and very strong labor unions that in terms of policy, they arrive at consensus in terms of what outcomes do we want and how do we do it? Yeah. So I guess in terms of, I'm looking at it, you say intuitively, right?
Yeah.
in terms of the democratic socialists, there's more potential. And how we measure that, I don't know, Stephanie, how we're going to measure that potential to create that action, right? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like coming across Nan Lin's description of social resources mobilized and instrumental actions was a real moment for me where I stepped back and I thought, hang on, aren't we talking about more, value rational modes of reasoning where we're internalizing the other people's needs, where we're working collaboratively and socially rather than instrumentally towards individual needs. And I think that realization and really starting to think in that way starts to explore those questions about what creates that potential. Is it purely a means end potential, where by everybody acting in their own self-interest, we're creating the maximum benefit or good or cooperation, whatever we might be talking about? Or are we actually talking about more of that sort of, moral, normative, subjective forms of reason that tend to be so missing from more traditional neoclassical economic theorizing potential, particularly. I mean, keeping in mind that many of the early social capital theorists were specifically attempting to overcome those shortcomings in neoclassical economic theorizing by including these other forms of reason, maybe not explicitly, but by extending beyond the principle of self-interest in human action. So to really to play that out, to really to do that well, I guess, then I think we need to have a look at different modes of reason here, which social capital theories do, because they include things like norms and trust, which are clearly not just in the cognitive instrumental modes of reason. But I think this is what we need to do. We need to explore this and these theoretical foundations in more detail.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes left, only about 2. If anyone has any further thoughts or questions or comments you'd like to make.
We'll just wait for your slides.
Yeah, I'll send them through by email a little later.
Are we doing the quantitative research methodology with Beverly tonight or tomorrow?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think we might wrap up this session. As Raymond just mentioned, the next event we're holding is a social capital research design and methods session with Beverly Sloan. And that's going to be happening at 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. And you can try and calculate what time that is in your particular time zone. But the session will be run twice to provide access for people in different parts of the world if you're interested in attending that session. We don't have any other webinars organized at the moment, but we are working on some more and we'll announce those as soon as they're ready to do so. So thanks everyone for attending, and look forward to seeing you all again in future.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you. Very helpful.